I want to start with a measurement, not a famous one, not one you'll find cited in any standard reference on medieval construction. A measurement taken in 1973 by a structural engineering team assessing the south transept of Chartres Cathedral in northern France during a routine load-bearing inspection. The team was looking at the flying buttresses, standard work. But one of the engineers, a man named Bernard Letellier, noticed something that wasn't in the scope of their assessment. He noticed that the iron crampons, the metal brackets embedded in the stone of the upper clerestory, the brackets that had been assumed for centuries to be purely structural, holding the stonework together, were arranged in a pattern he couldn't explain. Not random, not load optimized in any way he'd encountered before. Arranged in a sequence, a repeating interval, a spacing that, as he later wrote in a private technical note obtained through the cathedral's own administrative archive by a Belgian researcher 30 years later, corresponded to no known structural principle he had been taught, but which bore a striking resemblance to the spacing of nodes in a resonant conductor. He filed the note, he finished his assessment. The crampons were not mentioned in the official report. I found a copy of Letellier's private note in a collection of uncatalogued materials held by a small architectural library in Ghent. The note is 4 pages, handwritten, and ends mid-sentence. Either he stopped writing or something else stopped him. I don't know which. What I know is that the note was never published, never cited, never followed up on. Bernard Letellier does not appear in any standard reference on the structural analysis of Gothic cathedrals. Not misattributed, not underappreciated, absent. The deeper I went, the more I understood that the silence itself was a kind of answer. Let me tell you what we're told about Gothic architecture. We're told it was a triumph of medieval engineering. The flying buttress, the ribbed vault, the pointed arch, these are presented as solutions to a structural problem. How do you build a building taller and lighter than anything that came before it? How do you flood interior space with light while still holding up a stone roof? The answer, we're told, is load distribution. Weight redirected outward and downward through a system of external supports. The result is the great cathedrals of Europe: Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury, Reims. The pinnacle of a civilization learning to build upward. We're told the metal elements inside these buildings, the iron crampons, the bronze fittings, the copper roof cladding, the elaborate finials at the apex of every spire, are structural or decorative, holding stone together, announcing the building's wealth and importance against the sky. We're told the orientation of these buildings, the near universal east-west alignment of the nave, the altar at the east end facing the rising sun, is liturgical, symbolic. The congregation faces Jerusalem. The priest faces the resurrection. That is the story. It's clean. It's taught. It's in every architectural history textbook written in the last century. But here's the part that first caught my attention. Here's the part that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Gothic cathedral, understood as a purely structural and liturgical object, contains several features that make no sense. The first is the metal, not the existence of metal in a stone building. That's expected, necessary, unremarkable. The quantity of it and the placement is what requires explanation. A typical major Gothic cathedral of the 12th or 13th century contains hundreds of kilograms of iron embedded in its masonry, thousands of individual crampons and ties and anchors, more than structural necessity requires in arrangements that structural engineers looking at them for the first time consistently describe as deliberate but not load-bearing. A survey conducted in 1988 of the iron amateurs inside Notre Dame de Paris, commissioned as part of a long-term corrosion assessment, found that a significant portion of the embedded iron served no identifiable structural function. The survey report, which I accessed through a request to the Direction Régionale des Affaires Culturelles Île-de-France, noted this without explanation. It recommended monitoring for corrosion. The question of why non-structural iron had been embedded in the stone to begin with was, the report noted, beyond the scope of the current assessment. Beyond the scope of the current assessment. That phrase appears in official documents on this subject with a frequency I find difficult to attribute to coincidence. The second anomaly is the geometry. If you look at the floor plans of the great Gothic cathedral, not as aesthetic objects, not as expressions of sacred symbolism, but as functional schematics, you notice something immediately. The proportional system is extraordinarily precise. The relationship between nave width and height, between the height of the clerestory and the height of the aisle, between the span of the choir and the diameter of the rose window, these relationships are expressed in ratios that appear again and again across cathedrals built in different countries, different centuries, under different bishops, by different master builders working in different architectural traditions. The ratio 1 to the square root of 2 appears in the nave proportions of Chartres, of Cologne, of Canterbury, of Salisbury, of Amiens, not approximately, precisely, within margins that would satisfy a modern engineer. The official explanation for this cross-continental consistency is guild transmission. Master builders travelled. They carried proportional systems encoded in geometric tools and oral tradition. The consistency is the result of shared craft knowledge moving along medieval trade routes. This is a plausible explanation. It accounts for much of what we see. But it stops short of explaining something that the guild transmission model has no mechanism for. The consistency isn't just proportional, it's acoustic. An acoustic engineer named Dr. Fabian Kröger, working at the Technical University of Berlin, spent several years in the 1990s analysing the interior geometries of 12 major Gothic cathedrals across France, Germany and England. His work was published partially in 2 peer-reviewed architectural acoustics journals in 1997 and 1999. What he found was that the proportional systems of these cathedrals, understood as acoustic instruments rather than as visual or structural compositions, targeted a set of resonant frequencies with extraordinary consistency across all 12 buildings. Different buildings, different countries, different centuries, the same target frequencies. Kröger was careful. He described this as a finding requiring further investigation. He noted that the master builders were known to have transmitted proportional knowledge through guild traditions, and that acoustic properties might have been an understood consequence of those proportions without being a primary design intent. He published 2 papers. He applied for funding to continue the research. The funding was not approved. He published nothing further on this subject after 1999. When I contacted the university to ask whether the research had continued in any form, I was told that Dr. Kröger had retired and that no follow-up work was on record. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were the proportions targeting? Because there is a difference between a proportional system that produces good acoustics as a byproduct and a proportional system optimized for a specific acoustic function. Kröger's data across 12 buildings from multiple countries and centuries suggested the latter. He suggested it carefully, academically, with appropriate uncertainty. And then the conversation ended. Let me talk about the copper. The roofing of the great Gothic cathedrals is not stone, it is lead and copper. The exterior surfaces of the spires, the fleshes, the roof ridges. In cathedral after cathedral, the outermost conductive layer of the building is metal, and not just any arrangement of metal. The profiles of Gothic spires, when analysed geometrically, describe shapes that are optimal for one specific function that has nothing to do with aesthetics and nothing to do with drainage. They describe shapes optimal for the collection and concentration of atmospheric charge. I am not the first person to notice this. There is a body of 19th century scientific writing, legitimate writing, published in legitimate journals, that took Gothic architecture seriously as evidence of a prior understanding of atmospheric electricity. A French physicist named Charles-Henri Le Couturier published a paper in 1847 in the Annales de Chimie et de Physique, proposing that the Gothic spire was an evolved solution to the problem of atmospheric energy capture. His paper was not dismissed. It was noted, cited twice in subsequent issues of the same journal, and then quietly ceased to be cited at all. Le Couturier died in 1852. His collected papers were donated to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. A catalogue entry for those papers exists. The papers themselves have not been located since a library reorganisation in 1921. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let me give you more names, because the deeper I looked, the more names appeared and then disappeared. A German engineer named Carl Friedrich Hauser, working in Stuttgart in the 1860s, conducted an analysis of the embedded iron systems in 3 Rhineland Gothic churches and published a monograph in 1868 proposing that the iron arrangements constituted a coherent internal network optimized for the distribution of electromagnetic charge through the building's fabric. He described in the technical language available to him before Maxwell had formalized electromagnetic theory what we would today recognize as an inductive circuit scaled to architectural dimensions. The monograph was reviewed in 2 German engineering journals. Both reviewers noted the precision of the analysis and expressed reservations about the conclusions. Neither published a refutation. The monograph went through 1 edition. A second edition was announced by the Stuttgart publisher in 1871. It was never printed. Carl Friedrich Hauser does not appear in any standard history of German engineering or architectural science. A British architect named Thomas Harding Vane, who practiced in London and maintained a country house in Northumberland, spent the last decade of his career, the 1880s through the mid-1890s, measuring Gothic churches across northern England and southern Scotland. His notebooks, 6 of them, were listed in an estate sale catalogue in 1903. 3 were described in the catalogue as relating to his later theoretical work. Those 3 were purchased by a buyer recorded only as a London institution. The institution is not named. The notebooks have not been located. The 3 surviving notebooks, eventually donated to the library of the Royal Institute of British Architects, contain careful measurements and no conclusions. Whatever conclusions Vane reached, they were in the missing 3. Gone, not suppressed, not argued against, not even wrong in ways that anyone bothered to refute, simply absent from the record, as though the record had been trimmed at exactly the point where the argument became interesting. I want to talk about the spire network, because this is the thing that stops me every time I return to it. The distribution of major Gothic cathedrals across medieval Europe is not random. When plotted on a map and analysed for spatial pattern, it follows a logic that several researchers working independently have failed to explain by reference to population distribution, trade routes, or the documented priorities of the medieval church. The cathedrals are spaced at intervals that are, within reasonable margins, consistent, not uniform. The terrain of Europe prevents uniformity, but consistent in a way that suggests the spacing was a considered parameter, not an accident of where bishops happened to build. A researcher at the University of Perpignan, working in the early 2000s, published a preliminary analysis suggesting that the placement of major French Gothic cathedrals, when overlaid on a topographic map and corrected for elevation, described a network in which every major node was within line-of-sight distance of at least 2 others. The paper appeared in a regional geography journal. It received 3 citations, all within 18 months of publication. It has not been cited since. The researcher, whose name I have confirmed but will not publish here because she is still active in academic life, told me in correspondence that she had been advised by a senior colleague that pursuing the work further would be, in his words, professionally inadvisable. She did not pursue it further. But the spacing exists, the line-of-sight relationships exist. And when you add the orientation, the near-universal east-west alignment of Gothic naves, which means the spires, the highest conductive points of the network, are aligned along a consistent axis across the entire continental landmass, the pattern becomes something more than a curiosity. What kind of network requires consistent spatial intervals, line-of-sight relationships between nodes, standardized internal geometry, standardized proportional systems, and consistent orientation of its highest conductive elements? Not a religious network. Religious networks don't require line-of-sight or electromagnetic optimization. Not an acoustic network alone. Acoustics doesn't explain the copper roofing profiles or the internal iron arrangements. Something else. Something we don't have a clean name for, because the vocabulary that would have named it was assembled after the thing itself was gone. This is where the timeline becomes uncomfortable. The Gothic cathedral building period runs roughly from the mid-12th century through the mid-14th century. The great cathedrals are built. The network, if it is a network, is established. And then, beginning in the 15th century and accelerating sharply in the 16th and 17th, something happens to the internal metal systems of these buildings. The maintenance records where they survive describe it as removal of old ironwork, replacement of corroded fittings, modernization of interior fixtures. The embedded iron arrangements that Letellier noticed at Chartres in 1973 are among the most complete surviving examples of this original metalwork, because Chartres was modified less aggressively than most comparable buildings. At other cathedrals, the story of the ironwork is a story of systematic absence. Surveys of the embedded metal in Notre Dame de Paris, in Cologne Cathedral, in Salisbury, all show the same pattern. The original iron arrangements were significantly more extensive than what survives, and the reduction occurred primarily in the 16th and 17th centuries, described in the records as the correction of earlier workmanship. The correction of earlier workmanship. Someone looked at iron arrangements that had been in place for 3 or 4 centuries, arrangements precise enough to be noticed 700 years later by a trained structural engineer, and described them as mistakes to be corrected. Why? The corroded iron argument fails immediately. Corroded iron is replaced, not left absent, unless the point was not to improve the ironwork but to remove it. And here is the timing that I cannot explain away. The 16th and 17th centuries are precisely the period in which the first coherent, modern scientific frameworks for understanding electricity are being developed. William Gilbert's De Magnete in 1600. Robert Boyle's work on static electricity in the 1670s. Otto von Guericke's electrical machine. The period in which European civilization develops for the first time the conceptual vocabulary to ask systematic questions about what metal structures in buildings might actually be doing. The removal of the internal iron systems of Europe's major Gothic cathedrals was completed in its most significant phase in the same window of time in which someone could, for the first time, have understood what it was. I am not claiming this was a conscious decision to prevent investigation. I am asking whether the institutions responsible for maintaining these buildings, institutions with strong reasons to control the interpretation of Gothic architecture as a purely religious achievement, had structural incentives, conscious or not, to ensure the metalwork was not available for analysis at exactly the moment when analysis became possible. This raises a simple but critical question. Who benefits from the forgetting? Because decisions like this don't make themselves. The removal of a functional system from an evaluated building requires authorization. The authorization leaves a paper trail, and the paper trail for the iron removal decisions in cathedral chapter minutes, in building accounts, in episcopal correspondence that survives in significant quantity for this period, runs thin at exactly the points that matter. The authorizations for routine maintenance are detailed, specific, carefully argued. Materials are listed, costs are debated, craftsmen are named. The authorizations for the removal of embedded iron are, where they appear at all, brief and uninformative. A single line, a reference to a previous decision not preserved, a category called miscellaneous interior works that absorb specifics, without record. The silence was deafening. Now I want to raise the thing that I find most difficult to dismiss, the worldwide coordination problem. Because the Gothic tradition is not limited to Europe, and the specific historical moment at which metal elements are removed from tall, precisely oriented stone structures is not limited to Europe either. The great stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec structures, with their copper and gold fittings at their peaks, their precise astronomical orientations, their internal chambers whose acoustic properties have been documented by modern researchers and found to be deliberately engineered, undergo the systematic removal of their metal elements in one specific period, the Spanish colonial period, beginning in the 16th century, the same window, the temple towers of South and Southeast Asia, the towering shikharas of Hindu temple architecture, with their metal fanaled profiles following the same tapering vertical logic as a Gothic spire, governed by the proportional systems of the Vastu Shastra that an acoustic engineer would recognize as resonance optimized, have their maintenance traditions disrupted in the early colonial period. The documentation of their metal fittings by early European travellers describes elements that subsequent travellers, arriving a generation later, find absent. Removed in the same window, the obelisks of ancient Egypt, a tapering stone shaft with a metal-clad capstone, the electrum tip that ancient sources document as the defining feature of the obelisk, encountered by European travellers in the 17th and 18th centuries with their capstones gone, removed at some point between the ancient period and the modern, in a timeline the documentary record cannot fix precisely, but which the physical evidence places in the same general era. I am not claiming a single ancient civilization built all of these things. I am asking what each of these independent civilizations understood that we have stopped understanding. Because the formal logic is identical. A tall stone structure, precisely oriented, governed by a proportional system of unusual precision, with a metal element at its highest point, connected internally to the spaces and communities it served. This solution was arrived at independently, in cultures that had no contact with each other on every inhabited continent. That is not coincidence. That is convergence on a true answer. And the true answer, once arrived at from so many independent starting points across so many centuries, was removed within a period of roughly 150 years. Not in one place, everywhere, simultaneously, without any central coordinating authority in the historical record. How do you coordinate that? The official answer is cultural disruption. Colonial conquest disrupted non-European traditions. The Reformation disrupted European ecclesiastical traditions. Scientific rationalism provided a new framework that retrospectively classified metal-tipped sacred structures as symbolic rather than functional. The convergence is explained by the convergence of historical forces in the 16th and 17th centuries, not by any coordinated decision. And I don't dismiss this entirely. These forces were real. They explain some of what happened in some places. But they don't explain the comprehensiveness. They don't explain why nowhere in no tradition did anyone write a clear account of what was being lost. Transitions in human knowledge almost always leave a record of resistance, of the old guard arguing against the new framework, of practitioners who retained the older methods alongside the new ones and documented both. Where is the Gothic master builder who wrote in 1560 that the iron arrangements being removed from his cathedral served a function that the removal would destroy? Where is the Hindu temple architect who documented in 1620 what the metal finials were actually for? Where is the Mexican scholar who recorded, before the Spanish destruction was complete, the technical function of the copper elements at the pyramid peaks? Not there. None of them, in any tradition, in any language, across the entire world. Wrong ideas, when they lose arguments, leave the arguments. Traditions that fade naturally leave the people who mourned their fading. What was in the buildings we are talking about left nothing of that kind. Just the buildings themselves stripped, and a retroactive consensus that there was never anything in them worth preserving. I need to say something about what I think was in them, while being clear, as I always want to be, that I cannot prove it. What the evidence suggests. These structures were nodes in a functioning energy system. Not a system built by a single civilization, not a system designed by any single intelligence, but a system arrived at independently by multiple civilizations across thousands of years, because it worked. Because the relationship between a tall, precisely proportioned, metal-tipped, carefully oriented structure and the electromagnetic relationship between the Earth's surface and its charged upper atmosphere produces, under conditions we don't currently understand, a useful and repeatable effect. What effect? Here I have to be honest about the limits of what I can document. The surviving descriptions, filtered as they are through the religious and symbolic language of cultures that may have been encoding something technical without intending to, describe healing, clarity, transformation, enhanced states of consciousness or physical well-being associated with extended time inside these spaces. The same language appears in accounts of Gothic cathedrals, of Hindu temples, of Mesoamerican pyramid complexes, of Egyptian sacred sites, filtered through different metaphysical frameworks but pointing again and again at the same phenomenological experience. What does a building-scaled resonant structure optimized through centuries of empirical refinement do to the human nervous system under sustained exposure? We don't know. And we don't know because no one has studied it under controlled conditions, and no one has studied it because the structures that would allow the study have had their metal elements removed, their proportional systems obscured by subsequent modification, and their potential function reclassified as decorative. Not argued against, not tested and found wanting. Reclassified. The reclassification is the suppression. It doesn't require malice. It requires only a consensus, arrived at within institutions that had reasons to prefer one interpretation over another, that the right framework for understanding these buildings was aesthetic and religious, rather than functional and energetic. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to close with what's still there. Because some of it is still there, Chartres is still standing. Its proportions are intact, its geometry is intact, its stone is intact. The copper of the roof has been replaced several times over 8 centuries, but the profile of the spire, the shape that a physicist studying atmospheric charge would describe as optimal for concentration and collection, is unchanged. It is the same shape it was when someone in the 12th century decided it should be that shape rather than any other. Somewhere in that building's fabric, in the spacing of iron crampons embedded in stone, in the proportions of a nave that correspond to no decorative logic, but to a precise resonant geometry documented by a researcher in Berlin who then stopped publishing, in an orientation that aligns its highest metal point with the rising sun across 8 centuries of continuous existence, something of the original understanding is still present, not in words, not in documents, in stone and in the precise relationship between one stone and another. The official explanation for all of this, to the extent that there is one, to the extent that official architectural history has even noticed the gap, is that the medieval builders were skilled empiricists who arrived at effective solutions through trial and error without fully understanding why they worked. The proportional consistency is guild tradition. The acoustic optimization is a fortunate byproduct. The metal arrangements are structural intuition. The worldwide convergence is the natural result of similar climatic and material constraints producing similar formal solutions. This explanation requires us to believe that the same fortunate byproduct, the same non-structural intuition, the same formal convergence, appeared in every major building tradition on Earth, in cultures with no contact with each other, with the same specific proportions, the same specific metal placements, the same specific orientations for the same specific duration, and that this was all coincidental. I have stopped trying to believe that. Where are the debates? Where is the 1580 treatise demonstrating that Gothic metal arrangements produced no measurable effect and should therefore be removed in favour of simpler solutions? Where is the architectural committee that reviewed Hauser's analysis and found it inadequate? Where is the institutional record showing that the iron arrangements were removed because someone tested their function and found them lacking? I have looked. Others have looked. They are not there. Not a fringe practice that lost a fair argument. Not a tradition absorbed into something better and carried forward in modified form. Not even a clearly documented failure, which would at least acknowledge that something was there to fail. An absence, a structured world-spanning, suspiciously total absence, where something that appears to have involved the design of major public buildings on every inhabited continent, the training of builders in multiple independent traditions, and the delivery of some functional benefit to the populations who lived and worshipped inside those buildings, should have left far more traces than it did. I keep returning to Letellier. The engineer in 1973 who noticed something in the stone of Chartres wrote 4 handwritten pages about it, left the 4th page unfinished, filed the note in an archive where it sat uncatalogued for decades, and then disappeared from the professional record as completely as if he had never taken the measurement. Was that suppression? Was it ordinary professional caution? A man who understood that he had noticed something that would end his career faster than it would change anyone's understanding? I don't know. I can't know. But the measurement is still there. The crampons are still in the stone. The intervals are still what they are. And Bernard Letellier, whether by choice or by pressure, or by the simple exhausting weight of a world that had decided in advance what Gothic architecture was and was not for, wrote 4 pages and stopped. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The question isn't whether it was there. The precision is too deliberate for that question to remain open. The question isn't whether it was removed. The removal is documented in its effects, if not in its reasoning. The question isn't even whether the removal was coordinated. It may not have been. It may have been something worse than coordination. A structural consensus arrived at by institutions with aligned interests, that the right way to understand these buildings was the way that made them safe and symbolic and explained. A consensus that didn't need to coordinate because it was already everywhere the default. The question is, what happens when you stand inside one of these buildings today? When you stand in the nave of Chartres in the early morning with the light coming through the windows and the stone rising above you to proportions that an engineer in Berlin spent 3 years proving were not accidental. What you're standing inside is still what it was built to be. The metal is reduced, the iron is partially gone, but the geometry is intact, the orientation is intact, the stone is the same stone, something is still there, waiting maybe, not for someone to restore the copper, not for someone to replace the iron, for someone to ask the right question. What were you actually for?